This is Vanessa Gorman. This lesson is on understanding Greek verb morphology, which is to say understanding the English language terms we use to describe Greek language terms or other language terms in general. Last time I was banting around words like conjugation, and we're going to talk about what that means in this video. So first, let's talk about what a verb is. It's something that conveys an action, occurrence, or state of being. And in Greek, it is the one required unit. It is there. In English, you need at least two things if you have a regular sentence, which is to say you need at least a noun and a verb. If you have a command, you can use just a verb, come. But if you are just giving a regular sentence, the fewest words you can use are two he comes. In Greek, you can contain it all in one verb because we inflect the Greek language so thoroughly. Now, the first thing we've got to sort out are finite and non-finite verbs. Finite verbs are what we call conjugated. They're the ones that we change their form in accordance with how they are performing in the sentence. Non-finite verbs, including the obvious infinitives, but also participles, are words that do not take the verb endings of a conjugated verb, of a finite verb. Okay, what do I mean? That's hard to say without giving examples. Non-finite verbs, let's just go through them very quickly. We are not going to meet any non-finite verbs for the first unit in this class. We're putting that completely on hold until Unit 2 when we will explore all these aspects of the verb. The two forms of non-finite verbs are the infinitive, which is simply the basic form of the verb to go, to eat, to drink, to read, right? Any 2x version. Note, this is not the form you look it up in the dictionary. We look it up in the Greek dictionary under the first person singular, I eat, I go, I walk. So the infinitive can be used as a complementary infinitive, which means it's necessary to finish the meaning of a verb. I like isn't enough. I need to like something. Either I have to like a person or I have to like to do something. So I like to eat is a complementary use of an infinitive. It finishes the meaning of the verb. A substantive use is when you use an infinitive as a noun. So you make it into a thing, a substance. To get out of the house is a pleasure, right? It's the getting out of the house that we're enjoying in this sentence. So you can use infinitives as if they were nouns. The participle form is what's called a verbal adjective. It is derived from the verb, but it actually acts like an adjective. It's declined like an adjective in Greek, partially. It's got some features of a verb. And like an adjective, it acts as substantively, it can act like a noun. Blessed are the meek. It can act as an adjective, the running man, or it can act adverbially, swimming, I got very wet. This is the form that usually ends with ing or sometimes ed. So, for example, swimming is my favorite exercise is a substantive use. The watched pot never boils. The watched is describing the pot, so it's acting as an adjective. Coming into work late, I couldn't find a parking place, is an adverbial use. It's giving me an attendant circumstance that's not necessary to the sentence. So these forms, I want you to understand them so we can talk about them in English, but we're not going to talk about them in Greek for a while. But meanwhile, just to make sure you understand them, look at this same passage and decide what are the infinitives. And remember, not every to is an infinitive if it doesn't have a verb after it. So, for example, to the Hellespont in the first sentence is actually to acting as a preposition. Words can do different things. So where are the infinitives? Well, of course, to visit and to make war. which are the participles bearing friendly offerings and gifts and saying that the king ordered him to make war. So those are the non-finite verbs that we're not going to be dealing with. Just understand them in principle, and we'll come back to them in much more detail at a later date. Finite verbs are what we're going to be talking about now, and finite verbs are conjugated, and that means they have a person, number, tense, mood, and voice. This is how you describe the morphology of a finite verb. What is its person, number, tense, mood, and voice, and the fact that it is a verb. Not many English verbs are terribly conjugated. We conjugate slightly. I come, he comes. So we add an S for the third person. The best example in English is actually the verb to be. I am, you are, he is, we are, you are, they are. Even that isn't very conjugated in the sense that there's only 4 forms. But this gives you the idea. We don't say we am. We don't say they is. That's improper grammar. We don't use this kind of conjugation much, but Greek uses it all the time. There are other ways to identify a verb: person, number, tense, mood, voice. Mood is one of them, and for the time being, we are only going to use what's called the indicative mood. There are 4 moods in Greek. The indicative is used for any simple action. Just when you're talking in a straightforward way, you use the indicative mood. Imperative, if something is imperative, it has to be done. It's a word for command. Imperative. James, speak for yourself. A subjunctive is sometimes called the unreal mood. James might speak for himself if he had the opportunity. Optative, if you opt for something, you hope for something, you choose it. This is sort of the mood of wishing. Would that James could speak for himself. Now, we're not going to see these other 3 moods for quite a long time. And so I just want you to be aware that they exist and vaguely what they mean. But everything we see for the time being will be indicative. Likewise, there are different voices. Voice expresses the relationship between the action of the verb and its arguments. Now, an argument is something that has to be there for the verb to make sense. So, an active verb, the subject is the agent of the verb, is the one doing whatever the verb is. Themistocles won the election. Themistocles is the subject. He wins the election. This is an active verb. Passive verb, the agent usually expressed by a prepositional phrase or by a thing. The election was won by Themistocles. This is passive. He was killed with a club. This is passive. As one of my students once told me, if you can add the phrase by vampires, it's a passive verb. The third voice, which we get in Greek, is called the middle. And it's kind of a combination of the two. The subject is still the agent of the verb, but acts with some special reference to him or herself. So it has that sense of, I'm going to buy me a truck. That's sort of the slangy example I like to use. If Susan exercises in the middle, she's doing it for her own benefit. If Kaimon pours a libation in the active, he's doing it as a matter of fact for somebody else or whatever. But by putting it in the middle voice, it emphasizes the fact that he's looking out for himself. Okay? Some words change meanings from the active to the middle to the passive, and we'll be looking at the lexicon, which is the dictionary, to see how the meanings change. But for now, we're only going to look at actives. Now, the only thing that complicates this is there are some words that are called deponents, and deponents are active in meaning, but sometimes their form is middle or passive. They don't have a proper active form. And so all the verbs we are going to look at for the time being are going to be indicative, and they're going to be active in meaning. They may be deponent in form. But for now, passives and middles are on the back burner. So again, I'm simplifying the verb so that once we get to it, we can look at it in its entirety. But until then, we need to figure out all the parts of speech. So person, number, tense, mood, and voice. We've already talked about mood and voice. We're just going to do indicative. We're just going to do active or deponent. Person is pretty straightforward. It's the question of whether the word form refers to the person speaking, the person being addressed, or somebody else entirely. So first person is I or we, second person is you, and third person is he, she, it, or they. That's pretty simple. So first person can only be I or we. Likewise, as you can see here, we have number, which is just simply how many it refers to. I, you, he, she, it are all singular. We, you, and they are all plural. Greek has something called a dual that refers to two things acting together. And it's fairly rare and it's not worth memorizing. It's just worth knowing that if the word dual comes up, there's two subjects. It's pretty straightforward. So person and number are easy. Mood and voice are going to stay the same. The only thing that leaves us with is tense. And tense is not simply the time at which something happens, although that is certainly part of it. So it can mean whether something happened before, during, or after something else. So I walked yesterday. I am walking right now. I will walk tomorrow is before, during, after. But there's also something called aspect, and this is a very important part of tenses that we tend to gloss over in English, and that is whether the event we're talking about happened once and is done, happened once but leaves an effect that continues, or is ongoing, or is habitual, happens often. So we can classify these pretty easily. A single action completed. A single action is something that happens once and it's done, and that's it. So Jane walked here. I'm describing one action that happened, it's done. Now you can have single action with ongoing results, in which case we would say in English, Jane has walked here. As a result, she has arrived. So the difference between Jane walked here and Jane has walked here is the second one stresses the state of having arrived and is being here, whereas the first one's just a simple statement of fact. You can have a habitual or repeated action. So Jane walks daily. That's a simple way of saying this is a habit, right? And you can also have ongoing action. Jane is walking. She's not done doing it yet. So this is sometimes called progressive as opposed to a single action. So these are really the four ways that you can describe aspect of something. A single action completed, a single action with ongoing results, habitual or repeated action, and progressive ongoing action. But then you've got to mix it with time. Now, for the time being, we're going to simplify it. There are 7 tenses in Greek. 2 are rarely seen, the pluperfect and the future perfect. We'll mention them in the far distant future. 2 are fairly sparse, the perfect and the future. 3 are pretty mundane, which are the present, imperfect, and aorist. And frankly, we're just going to start with the imperfect and aorist. We're going to start with the tenses that are used to tell a story in the past, because we're going to be dealing with a war narrative for the most part, Xenophon's Hellenica, and I want to simplify it as much as possible. So we're going to talk about 2 tenses for now, and we're going to talk about 2 people for now. So we're going to use the third person singular and the third person plural, and that's it. We're going to use the imperfect and aorist, and that's it. So simple statements in independent clauses where the subject is always the actor, only active deponent. So the only difference is whether there are one person or thing acting or multiple people or things acting. And then the 2 tenses. Well, what are the 2 tenses? The imperfect tense is anything that is incomplete in the past. They're both past tenses. But imperfect is continuous, repeated, or incomplete. So this is usually translated as was or were, sometimes with ed. In English, we would call this the past progressive. I don't usually use that term in Greek. I just talk about incomplete or habitual action. But you can almost always translate it was or were. The army was marching. They were tired. Every spring, the army marched against Caria. I can use the ed form because I'm talking about a repeated action, and I know that because of the adverbial phrase every spring. So was or were is usually a safe bet for the imperfect tense or anything that's continuing going on, as opposed to the aorist tense, which is a simple past action that's done. And so we have continuous or repeated past actions, and we have simple past actions that are done. So aorist is he sailed into Ephesus, the great king wept. Usually it's the ed form. And these are the only two tenses we're going to look at for now. So for each verb that I give you, you're going to have 4 words to understand. A third person singular imperfect, a third person plural imperfect, a third person singular aorist, and a third person plural aorist. So, for example, here's a short passage. What is the morphology of these forms? So, the Athenians attacked him. We know that there is more than one subject, so it is a plural, third person plural for attacked. It's in the past, so it's imperfect or aorist, and they did it once. So it's a third person aorist indicative active. That's how you would identify this. If I asked you what's the morphology of attack, you would say it's a verb in the third person aorist indicative active. In English, we have a verb phrase, did battle. Again, this would be one word in Greek. And it's the same, a third person, plural, aorist indicative active. At some points, they were victorious. This would be one word in Greek. Likewise, were defeated. You see the were, you know this is not a simple statement, but rather a generalization. So it's an imperfect. They were defeated, they were victorious. And then finally, Alcibiades sailed into the Hellespont. We've changed subjects, and now we have a third person singular, and it's a single action, so we have aorist. Likewise, if you look at these verbs, Hermocrates felt exceedingly the loss of his care. Those who associated with Hermocrates felt. So felt, the subject of felt is those, so it's plural. And it's happened once, so they, third person plural aorist. Used to gather, this is a way of saying a habitual action, and the subject is he, so we have a third person singular imperfect indicative active. Where he communicated to them, communicated is in a subordinate clause, so that could be various things, but generally speaking, you would say imperfect because at every evening, at evening in his own tent every day, he communicated to them as the sense of an ongoing action. So the question is, how do you know what you're looking at? Well, there's several ways. One is we're going to use this morphological analyzer that's called Alpheus. Or you can look it up in other online tools like Perseus or Arethusa in the trees, but Alpheus is going to be our go-to method. You're going to click on a word and it will tell you. Now, there's often several forms that each word can take, so you need to be able to make decisions, or the machine is sometimes wrong and you need to be able to know that that's a mistake. So you need to know something. If you just depend on the machine, you will make some mistakes, but you can depend on it a lot. You can also look them up in a lexicon, which is our word for a dictionary, a fancy word for a dictionary. Some Greek textbook or grammar book as well. And the simplest thing in some ways may be to memorize the most common forms. And certainly at least to understand the process by which we arrive at those forms. And that's where we're going to go now. Do you have to memorize the process? No. but you should understand the terms used to describe it. Let me start by saying there are 137 verbs that occur more than 20 times in our sample text, Xenophon's Hellenica. I pulled out 35 of those top verbs. These are the ones that are used actively in the indicative, most commonly with third person singular or plural, in the imperfect and aorist. So these are the ones we're going to see in the first chapters. That is the chapters of the first unit while we're learning all the different parts of speech. Again, I want to remind you the lemma is the lexicon entry, and this will be the first person singular present indicative active form. Every lemma for anything that is not defective is first person singular present indicative active. Sorry. Verbs in Greek are labeled with 6 principal parts. Principal parts are forms that have been pulled out by grammarians in order to give you all the possible roots for all the possible forms of a verb. They give us the stems for everything, in other words. A Greek verb has something like 360 conjugated forms, so they have different stems. The first principal part is the lemma, the first person singular present indicative active, and it gives us the present active stem. That's going to be important because we get the imperfect from the present active stem. The second principal part is the same thing, but it's the future, and we're not going to deal with futures right away. The third principal part is the aorist, first person singular aorist indicative active. Again, we need this one because we're going to be using it. We go on, and the other remaining principal parts are forms we'll look at in the future. So what I'm telling you is, if you need to look up what form an aorist came from, you need to know the third principal part. If you need to know what root the imperfect comes from, you need to know the first principal part. So you will see lists of principal parts, and I'll link you into a list of principal parts, and they tend to go along certain patterns. So thuo means I am sacrificing. Ethusa is the aorist, I sacrificed, completed action in the past. Pempo, I send. Epemsa, I sent. So archo, erxa, echo, eskon, lambano, elabon, erchomai, and elthon. These are examples of principal parts, and for now, all we care about are the first and the third, if you go to look them up. Now, there are going to be categories of verbs that I'm going to put them in to help understand how you inflect them, how you conjugate them. First off, there's a bunch of what are called just regular verbs. They follow the standard easy rules. And these are some of the ones I'm going to give you. Apokteno, I kill. This narrative is about wars, so we're getting a lot of killing and dying and marching and fighting words, but that keeps the vocabulary under control and limited, so that's why I like it. Archo, it means I begin, literally, so if it can mean I am first, I am the ruler. So this is, we get the sense of I rule from that. Bino is to march or to go. Heiko, with a rough breathing, I come or I am present. Thuo is sacrifice. Lego literally means collect, but it has come to mean normally I say. It can also mean I reason, but normally it means I say. Meno, I remain. Pempo, I send. Pleo, I sail. Praso, or prato sometimes, I make or do. Strateuo, I wage war. You see the word strategy in there. And then tato, I array or I station. These are all going to follow regular rules. Then we have 8 what are called contract verbs. These are verbs whose root ends with a vowel, and therefore when it combines with endings, it will contract and get a long accent, a circumflex. So you won't see adikeo in a text, I am doing wrong. Instead, you will see adiko with a circumflex on it, to indicate that it has contracted, it is what's called an epsilon contract verb. Most of these are epsilon contracts, but in the lemma, they actually write out the contraction so that you know why the vowels are changing. So DK is justice, is what's called an alpha privative. It makes it the negation. So I do wrong, hyreo, I take, apochoreo, I retreat, boetheo, I help, nikao, you see Nike in there, Nike, I conquer, poieo, I make or do, we get poet and poetry from this word, polemeo, I fight a war, a polemic is a hostile um, speech or something. Phobeo, I am afraid. We get the word phobia from that. We get 6 verbs that have something called a second aorist form, which is a different form for the aorist than you might expect than the regular verbs. Ago, I lead. Echo, I hold. Lambano, I take. Fugo, feugo, I flee. You get the word fugitive there. Balo, I throw. Remember ballistics. And apothnesco, I die. There's also 5 verbs that will have deponents instead of the normal active form. Remember, I talked to you about these. They are often identified as present indicative middles because the deponent form is, in fact, the middle form. So, aphikneomai never comes as aphikneo. It never gets that omega ending of the others. Aphikneomai, I arrive. Gignomai, I become, a very, very common word, as you might expect. Likewise, erchomai, I come. Hegeomai, I lead. We get hegemony straight from this. And machomai, I fight. Finally, there are 4 words I'm going to give you that are called me verbs because they end with me. And these are some of the very common words. There's a few others that we'll meet down the line, but especially the verb I am, the verb to be, a me. Histemi, didomi, and apolumi. You can see they look something like deponents that end with my, but these are a very small category of fairly common words. There's a couple of others that you'll see fairly often, but there's only 8 or 10 in all that you ever come across your radar. So these are all the verbs that we're going to be talking about in this class for the first half of the class. And next, I want to go through how we form the imperfect and aorist of these different verbs.